Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Vanshika Saraf, and today we're discussing the military relationship between China and Pakistan, a partnership that has often been described as higher than the Himalayas, deeper than the oceans, and sweeter than honey. But beyond this rhetoric, what does the relationship actually look like in operational terms? Are China and Pakistan as militarily integrated as NATO? Or is their cooperation significant but structurally limited? To answer that, we are joined by my colleague Aishwaria Sonavane. She is research analyst for Pakistan Studies and recently published a paper on the limits of their interoperability. So, Aishwarya, to start off, can you explain what we mean by this term military interoperability when analysts talk about that term in the context of China and Pakistan? What are they referring to?
Hi, Vanshika. Thank you for talking to me. And to begin answering your question, I think at the most basic level, interoperability refers to the ability of two or more militaries to operate together effectively. That includes communicating securely, sharing data in real time, coordinating logistics, aligned doctrine, and conducting joint operations across land, air, sea, cyber, and space domains. But there's a more precise definition, and it comes from NATO. NATO kind of defines interoperability as the ability of aligned forces to train, exercise, and operate effectively together in the execution of assigned missions and tasks. Now, that definition is deceptively simple because achieving this level of interoperability requires deep structural alignment. So, this involves compatible communication systems, shared data links, integrated command and control architectures, aligned operational doctrines, interchangeable logistics and sustainment chains, standardized procedures. So, as per NATO's definition, interoperability essentially allows multinational forces to sort of function almost as a single military entity. And this is the best example that we have for military interoperability, the way NATO member states operate.
Right. So, in that context, how close do you think China and Pakistan are to that level of integration?
That's something that I cover in my paper, but before narrowing down to the paper, we need to understand the broader military relationship between China and Pakistan. Now, the defense ties between both of these countries dates back to the 1960s when Beijing began supporting Islamabad diplomatically and militarily in the aftermath of the China-India war and the growing India and Soviet Union cooperation back in the day. Pakistan was also one of the first Muslim countries to recognize the People's Republic of China back in the early 1950s. And through the Cold War and afterwards, both countries found themselves aligned against common pressures, which especially was India. And over the decades, China has become Pakistan's main arms supplier. Almost 80% of military exports to Pakistan come from China. And this has become especially after the US reduced or paused military support at various points. So I think over the decades, the relationship has deepened in three distinct ways. Firstly, arms transfer and co production. China is now Pakistan's largest arms supplier, like I mentioned earlier, and major platforms include JF-17 Thunder, which is a jointly produced fighter aircraft. We also saw this aircraft come in the news when Pakistan made deals with the Libyan National Army, Sudan, to kind of export these jointly produced aircraft. The J-10CE multi-role fighters, VT-4 main battle tanks, the HQ-9 air defense systems, which was also used in Operation Sindoor, Type 054 AP frigates, the Hangar class submarines, which is currently under the acquisition process. And I won't get into the technical details of these military equipment, but this relationship kind of goes way beyond just procurement, right? It now includes joint production and technology transfer. Second is, I think, nuclear and strategic cooperation. China has played a very critical role in Pakistan's nuclear and missile development in earlier decades. This fundamentally shaped the strategic balance in the Indian subcontinent. And finally, thirdly, what I think is expanding joint exercises. Today, when we look at this relationship, China and Pakistan now conduct regular exercises, which includes the Shaheen drills, which is an Air Force drills between the forces on both sides, the Warrior Army exercises, and the Sea Guardians naval cooperation. And I go into the detail of each of these exercises in my paper. But at first glance, this level of engagement kind of suggests a very highly integrated military partnership. However, this is where the findings of my paper becomes important. Um, Equipment transfers and joint drills do exist, but they do not automatically equal deep interoperability. We've heard this term being widely used in the media, but it's important that we kind of break it down further.
Right. Thank you for giving a broad idea of the overarching relationship that exists presently. But coming back to your last point, so what is the core argument when it comes to this relationship and that you've argued in your paper?
Right. So my paper's analysis makes a careful but important distinction. Today, China and Pakistan have extensive military cooperation, and we already know this. We see this in our policy circles, our in news reports. We also saw this during the May 2025 conflict between India and Pakistan. And we'll come back to the conflict again, but however, they do not yet demonstrate full interoperability in the sense of where NATO is at present. And I keep going back to NATO because at present, that is the best example of how multiple militaries have sort of combined their forces together under this one umbrella. The paper argues that while exercises and arms sales create familiarity and tactical coordination, deeper integration kind of requires more structural alignment. And that alignment remains incomplete at present. And let's unpack why. Again, there are a few differences that limit this military interoperability. Firstly, there are differences in the command and organizational structures. China's People's Liberation Army, it operates under the Central Military Commission and is structured into theater commands designed for joint multi-domain operations. And I'm not a Chinese defense military expert, but that's how the overall structure operates. But when it comes to Pakistan's military structure, it's starkly different. Historically, it's been more service centric, and though it has taken steps towards jointness, it does not mirror PLA reforms. Also, we have to understand, since the Pakistan's 27th Amendment, now all three forces of Navy, Army, and Air Force are kind of under this one person. So the Pakistani military structure is also very individual centric. Asim Munir is the CDS of Pakistan today and consolidates significant power. So interoperability at the highest level requires compatible command architectures, and that alignment is not fully present right now. Secondly, there are also doctrinal divergences in the militaries of both these countries. China's doctrine increasingly emphasizes on integrated joint operations, informationized and intelligentized warfare, multi-domain command networks. Meanwhile, when we look at Pakistan's, their doctrine remains primarily India focused when it comes to external actors. With India focused primarily, now we can obviously consider Afghanistan as well, considering the conflict and the restive border that it shares with Afghanistan. But that's an issue, again, that's a separate conversation altogether. But Pakistan's doctrine remains primarily India focused, with operational concepts shaped by geography, force asymmetry, and escalation management. The two militaries, China and Pakistan, train together, yes, but they're preparing for very different strategic contingencies. Thirdly, there are visible technological incompatibility between both these countries. Pakistan kind of operates a hybrid arsenal. For instance, the Pakistani military actively uses US origin F 16 fighters, Western communication systems. At the same time, it uses Chinese J-10 aircraft, Chinese air defense networks. So these Western and Chinese systems often use incompatible data links and encryption standards. So that kind of complicates real time integration operation between China and Pakistan. And even though defense aid has sort of stopped from the US to Pakistan under Trump's first administration, they still, I remember a couple of months ago, they still got funded for repair and maintenance of these F 16s. So the Pakistani military is very much still using Western equipment, and full interoperability would require harmonized digital ecosystems. And that process, I would say, is still ongoing from all the information that we have right now.
That's very interesting. So, I want to spend some time discussing the conflict between India and Pakistan that we witnessed last year in May. So, what was the cooperation like at that point between China and Pakistan against India, so to say?
That's very interesting. Also provides great insight into how China-Pakistan military relationship can directly affect India, at least at present. Pakistan's military apparently deployed Chinese origin equipment in active combat. The Pakistani Air Force apparently flew the Chengdu J-10C fighter jets, which were equipped with PL-15 long-range air-to-air missiles against Indian aircraft. And this may have been the first combat use of these systems. China also apparently provided, and I use the word reportedly and apparently because these are all speculations, have been reported in our newspapers by both domestic and international publications. But China provided satellite support, radar and air defense network adjustments to Pakistan during the conflict. And these adjustments included reorganizing Pakistan's radar deployment and modifying satellite coverage to improve surveillance of Indian force movements. Some media sources have also documented that China's Beidou satellite navigation system and high resolution satellite imagery were used during the 4 day conflict to support Pakistan's situational awareness and targeting. Uh, Now, again, these capabilities are very distinct from US controlled GPS. However, and I say it again, it is significant to distinguish support from fully institutionalized integration. So while China's provision of weapons, ISR inputs, and space based navigation assistance does demonstrate a significant level of cooperation and capability sharing, there's no public evidence that the PLA, the Chinese PLA, entered into a joint command structure with Pakistan's military during the crisis, or that the two militaries kind of fought under a single unified warfighting organization. So, from how I see it, what was visible in the May 2025 clash was high level strategic enablement, which included hardware deployment, surveillance assistance, and possible shared use of satellite and radar assets rather than a merged, interoperable military command directing integrated operations. And this distinction is very critical when assessing the depth of military ties between China and Pakistan, especially in contrast to formal alliances where command control and real time operational integration are institutionalized by design.
Right, on the question of this, so despite all of this cooperation that you've just mentioned, What is holding back both China and Pakistan from really formalizing this into something more concrete, a full blown sort of alliance where things are written down, there are written down obligations? What is it that's holding them back from doing this?
Right, that's a very interesting question and also very important. I think when we talk about China and Pakistan, the idea of this paper only came because I read so much about the the China-Pakistan military relationship and how these militaries were growing, with, of course, Chinese becoming Pakistan's primary military exporter. But this absence of a formalized, full blown defense alliance between China and Pakistan is not without a reason, right? It seems like China's attempts to sort of prevent binding defense treaties that might obligate it to jump into conflicts directly, even if it is in China's favor to have sort of low level conflicts and friction between India and Pakistan. So that kind of prevents India. That's the Chinese idea where it comes from, that any low level conflict between India and Pakistan will keep India occupied on their western borders and kind of preoccupied from the Chinese borders. So I think even if it's in China's favor to have low level conflicts and friction between India Pakistan, this relationship between Islamabad and Beijing has been described as a threshold alliance, which essentially means that there's strategic cooperation and mutual interest, but not a formal treaty based defensive pact. For Pakistan, this ambiguity benefits them. It kind of allows Chinese military support, diplomatic support, without completely cutting them off from Western defense market, or not even at present, even if not the Western defense market, but also, it helps Pakistan from maintaining these Western ties and financial institutions like IMF. As we know, given Pakistan's financial condition, financial challenges and situation, it heavily depends on the IMF even today. So, in a way, I would say that both sides are keeping things flexible rather than, locked in with legal obligations. So, this lack of defense agreement definitely benefits both sides.
Right, that makes sense. And then looking at the bigger picture, what does this limited partnership mean for regional security on the whole, when it comes to India, the US, and all other actors really which are watching closely?
For sure, this matters regionally. Even if full interoperability has not been achieved, the growing defense cooperation does affect strategic calculations, especially for India. There have been concerns of a two front challenge. Um, in India, something again we speak about in our policy circles, China's defense and diplomatic support to Pakistan definitely enhances Islamabad's deterrent and operational capacity. And Beijing also gets leverage in the subcontinent without, being pulled into military commitments. But the limitations mean that Pakistan can't be treated as simply an extension of Chinese military power. Each side still has its own strategies and its limitations. And that uncertainty is actually a big factor in how neighbors like India and external powers like the US formulate their own policies when it comes to both China and Pakistan.
Right. So, just the last question before we wrap up. Where do you think this partnership is heading in the future? Do you expect both the countries to increase their interoperability? Or do you think these barriers that you mentioned, do you think that will keep them from being a larger military bloc down the line?
That's something that we all will be thinking about. I think we'll see more cooperation, more joint tech development, more exercises, maybe deeper intelligence sharing, especially as China's investments in Pakistan's infrastructure and security deepen under CPEC, which is starting its phase two now. But again, this also has a lot to do with Pakistan's internal security situation. CPEC projects face immense security threats from Baloch insurgent groups like the Baloch Liberation Army in the restive provinces of Balochistan, And of course, there's the threat in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa by the Tehreek-e-Taliban. There have been several attacks against Chinese nationals, Chinese interests. So that's something that China will consider for also its economic aspirations. However, coming back to my paper and my conclusion is that I don't see full interoperability in the near future, mainly because of those structural and doctrinal differences that we spoke about earlier, and because Pakistan still wants to balance its ties with the West. We all saw Field Marshal General Asim Munir making several rounds of the US. He even had that infamous lunch at the White House with President Trump in 2025. They clearly want Western investments. US is interested in minerals in Pakistan now. Islamabad is also in talks with Australia for the mineral resources. But again, that's another conversation and we could do a whole podcast on it. But I will actually take this opportunity to also shamelessly plug in Pakistan Pegam, my newsletter where I cover Pakistan beyond the noise in the media. The idea of this newsletter is to build a body of work which kind of gives a very dispassionate, objective analysis of what Pakistan is as a country and extremely important neighbor for India. But coming back to your question, Vanshika, I think it's likely to stay this kind of strategic but asymmetric partnership rather than a fully integrated alliance, at least in the immediate future.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Aishwarya, and thank you to our listeners. That was our deep dive into the China-Pakistan military relationship, why it's important, where it stands today, and what it means for the region as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.